6 Music.
We're celebrating the life of David Bowie.
This is
6 Music's David Bowie Forever.
Right now, it's
Hugh Stevens and Neil Tennant.
It's BBC Radio 6 Music, and my guest is the eloquent, distinguished, the celebrated wordsmith and musician, friend and collaborator of David Bowie for David Bowie Forever Day here on 6 Music. Neil Tennant, very welcome to the programme. How are you?
I'm very good. Nice to be here and to talk about David Bowie. I wouldn't say he was a friend.
Okay.
We enjoyed working with him. We had a David Bowie moment in, when was it, 1995 to 6. And it was a very special moment doing a collaboration with David Bowie, appearing on Top of the Pops with him, being on the Brits with him. Not many people could say they performed on Top of the Pops with David Bowie.
It's incredible.
And I'm always chuffed that on the Best of Bowie album, there are, I think, 3 duets. One with Mick Jagger, one with Queen, and one with the Pet Shop Boys.
That's a great company, isn't it? We will play and hear a Hello Space Boy a little bit later. But you've chosen all the music for this hour of the programme. And Neil, we started with Where Are We Now? Why did you want to start sort of towards the end of David's musical story?
I wanted to start there because this was a moment where people thought David Bowie had given up. There were rumours he was ill, which actually he wasn't at that point. Chris and I were in Berlin, and we have a studio and an apartment there, and we were just about to get the plane back to London. And a friend of mine texted me, David Bowie's released a new single, and I looked at it on YouTube or something, and it was so moving being in Berlin and hearing David Bowie talk about his past life and his memories of this famous period in Berlin where he lived with Iggy Pop, as I'm sure everyone knows. And also as the first track for a new album, which no one had been expecting, to do something so reflective and sort of melancholy and mentioning all these real places. It was really just an incredibly moving moment. And I know other people of my sort of generation felt the same thing because we'd been with David Bowie since Space Oddity, or particularly since Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory, that suddenly here he was still making the most beautiful record. Anyone who's a fan of an artist is always thrilled when the artist, after several decades, can still make a really fantastic record, because there's very few artists can actually do that.
Mm. So when did Bowie enter your life, Neil? How old were you first hearing him?
First hearing Bowie was Space Oddity, which I think was done in 1969. You know, I got out of bed when I was 13 or 14 years old to watch the landing on the moon. Mm. And then also not long afterwards there was the film 2001 Space Odyssey, and of course Bowie's title is a pun on that, Space Oddity. That was just one of those tracks in some ways, and I think Bowie probably might have thought this too, a classic one-hit wonder. It came out of nowhere and you wondered where it was going to lead to, because it's such a beautiful arrangement. I mean, I thought West End Girls was potentially a classic one-hit wonder record, because where does it come from? Where does it go to? We've never done anything like it since. Bowie never really did anything like Space Oddity again. Both of those songs are such mood pieces, they have this incredible mood. But then he went away, so he was a one-hit wonder for 3 years. He went to the next record, The Prettiest Star. I don't remember ever hearing at the time. It crops up on Aladdin Sane, but you never heard it again. And then he does this song, London by Tartar. I didn't hear this record until a friend of mine had a bootleg of it in the 80s or 90s. And one of the things I like about Bowie is his Londonness. And also in London by Tartar, 1970, he kind of hears glam rock coming. He's also friendly with Mark Bolan. There's a really interesting thing that in 1969, and David, Mark Bolan and Elton John all know each other. Mm. They're all playing clubs. They're all playing the Marquee, for instance. David has a hit. David's winning, but then David's losing. Because Mark, at the end of 1970, has a huge hit with Ride a White Swan. And suddenly he's the biggest thing in Britain. He's the new Beatles. Then Elton suddenly makes it in America with Your Song and the album with that on, Tumbleweed Connection, all that stuff.
This is the song.
And David still hasn't made it. And
the drama, Neil, the drama. No wonder you became a journalist.
And so David does this record, London by Tata, and he gets Mark Bolan to play. Mark's just started playing electric guitar. Mark hasn't made it yet either. And during the recording session, Mark's wife, June, throws a total wobbler, apparently, and says, Mark's too good for you. He shouldn't even be playing on your record. and Mark doesn't really talk to David, and he plays the guitar solo on this. But anyway, I think David kind of feels the glam rock thing coming. And also, David's a real Londoner. He's one of the great London pop stars. You know, he's from Brixton and then Beckenham and all the rest of it. And you can sort of feel David in sort of Brixton Market listening to this. So Bowie then, carrying on, Bowie goes, as we used to say, smash hits down the dumper. But then he, The Man Who Sold the World comes out. I'm not aware of it, to be honest. Some cool people I know say, oh yeah, we knew that record. But I don't think anyone really knew of it. But then he makes Hunky Dory. And Hunky Dory is probably his best album. It's a sort of pointless thing to say, but of all the albums, it's probably one I like best. And he appears on the Earl Grey Whistle Test. My brother and I used to sit up and watch the Earl Grey Whistle Test. We were allowed to stay up because it was on like 11 o'clock at night, And the Earl Grey Whistle Test is like January 1972. So this is 2.25 years since Space Oddity, And David's had his hair cut. He's got the short dyed red hair, and he's wearing that sort of spaceman suit thing, the sort of quilted fabric thing. And the camera goes right on him, right on his face, and he sings 5 years. And it's absolutely mesmerising.
We had 5 years left to science.
And my brother Simon and I immediately become obsessed by David Bowie. I couldn't afford to buy albums. Albums were expensive. I used to get 2 and 6 pocket money a week. A friend and I used to go into the posh music shop in Newcastle, which is called Windows, which sadly just shut last year. And in the classical department, they had stereo listening booths. You could hear records in stereo. We used to go in after school and say, can we hear Hunky Dory by David Bowie, please? In the stereo booth. And it still brings that back to me when I hear the start of Hunky Dory, just the song changes. It still brings it back to me. And then I went to see Bowie play in Newcastle in 1972, in June 1972, when I was doing my A-levels. The City Hall in Newcastle was half empty. We knew a lot of the songs by then. Ziggy Stardust was about to come out. A friend of ours worked at the RCA factory, which was in the northeast of England. We actually had an advance copy just a few days before it came out. And afterwards, we hung around backstage and got his autograph. And I remember thinking, wow, he's gay. Apparently he's gay. And I didn't think I was gay, but my friends and I, we were all in a theatre group, and we were sort of a bit theatrical. And so it was very thrilling being in the same space very briefly with him. But at that concert, I had never encountered charisma on that level. It's a very difficult thing to describe charisma, and this is in a half-empty hall. When you look at, I know when you look up on the stage, happened to us once or twice, and you see a lot of empty seats. It's a bit depressing, But he's giving, as we now say, 110%, and he looks and sounds just otherworldly. He's putting on being camp. He's done that interview with the Melody Maker where he says he's gay. This is actually quite a short moment in David Bowie's life, the gay David Bowie moment. And afterwards you get the impression he's a bit embarrassed by it because he wasn't really gay, although maybe he'd had sexual experiences with men. But he obviously realises that's a new thing. Being gay, it's a bit out there. And he goes to a club, which I used to go to when I moved to London later that year, the Sombrero in Kensington High Street, which had a sort of light-up dance floor. You would now think of Saturday Night Fever, but this is several years previously. And I know he'd plugged into this gay thing. And the gay thing in those days, it was before the clone thing of, moustaches and checked shirts. It was when everyone was a bit glam and wearing satin shirts. And I think he must have really felt that was a thing that was happening. And he knew, obviously, gay people. And he just kind of wanted to be part of it. And actually, it had a good effect because he used the shock value of it, because to say, I'm gay, in 1972 was really shocking. But also he made a change, even though ultimately he was a heterosexual man. He's a part of gay history because he was the first person to really do that.
And I want to come back to the queer experience and that part of the story. I want to pick up on London. You mentioned Bowie. Bowie gets a mention along with, I think, Roxy Music in your own song in New London Boy.
Follow the style, plastic and showy. Everyone's dancing to Roxy and Bowie.
Well, this is a song from our last album, and I was just thinking about me coming down to London in September 1972 to go to the Polytechnic in North London and study history. And well, my friends and I, we all liked David Bowie, and there was this sort of a year zero thing with Ziggy Stardust and Roxy Music. Bowie introduced us to Velvet Underground. I wasn't aware of them before that.
Very cool.
Iggy Pop. Bowie produces Raw Power, one of their famous albums. So he was my life. In those days, when you left school, what you tended to do was to grow your hair long. You used to get told to cut it, and all I said, actually, I did the opposite. I cut my hair because I thought I don't want to look like a student in loon pants and long hair. And people were quite shocked. And it was because of David Bowie, really. He was a star. And he announced he was a star, and through his management organisation, they presented him as being a star. We were all very impressed. There was a series of articles by Charles Shaw Murray in the NME called, I think it was Bowie at the Dorchester, where he was meeting the press to talk about Ziggy Stardust. They were serving cocktails. They served a cocktail that was whiskey and peach juice, it said. So we used to go into bars in Newcastle, proving we had a certain amount of courage, bear in mind this is Newcastle, and say, can we have 2 whiskey and peach juices, please? Well, of course, to this day, you won't get peach juice in a pub. But it definitely had an effect that you felt you were lining up with the different people. And when we were at watching at the Newcastle City Hall in June 72, we were tittering at all his various comments he was making, his little in-jokes. And he said, this next song is for all the strange people in the audience. And we kind of felt that was us.
Wow. It's all spine-tingling stuff. It's beautiful. Let's talk about the trilogy, the Major Tom trilogy, Space Oddity, Ashes to Ashes, and your collaboration, you're sort of reworking, what do you call it? It's not a remix strictly, is it? It's both of you singing.
It's called Pet Shop Boys Remix on the Bowie releases.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's a reimagining of it, really. When Bowie had his exhibition not long before he died, I think at the V&A, I went to a preview, and when you went in, there was actually a reference to the Major Tom trilogy.
And had you heard of this before?
Well, we'd concluded the trilogy by Chris's suggestion of cutting up Space Oddity. We'd actually made it into a trilogy, and I said this when Bowie's in the studio. I said, when Major Tom's back, and Bowie said, but where is he now? And I said, oh, it's like he's in one of those Russian spaceships they can't afford to bring down anymore. And Bowie said, oh, is that where he is?
Oh, wow.
And he wasn't being funny. He went with the thought. He went with the imagination of that. That's where Major Tom was.
This is ground control to Major Tom.
So in Space Oddity, you've got Major Tom lonely in space, like an American astronaut. He's very much an American astronaut. What shirts you wear and all that kind of stuff. And then he suddenly re-emerges in Ashes to Ashes, which I think is 1980. We know Major Tom's a junkie. So you sort of imagine that the afterlife of an astronaut, very famous, world famous even, and yet what kind of life is it? He becomes a junkie. You know, the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, he became a huge celebrity and the Soviet Union used him as a celebrity. But in fact, he more or less became an alcoholic and he died in a plane crash.
Right.
And he's a sort of Major Tom character as well, really. And I when I read about Yuri Gagarin later, I thought, oh wow, Major Tom. We know Major Tom's a junkie. And then, of course, he gets this other return to life with Hello Space Boy in his Russian spaceship that they can't afford to bring down.
So let's get into Hello Space Boy.
Yeah, so in 1995, I went to see David Bowie on his Outside tour. Bowie had made an album with Eno for the first time in about 16 years or something. And I like that album. I still like it. And I went to the show at Wembley Arena, and we were invited. I was with my friend, the writer John Savage. Bowie very much like John's book about the Sex Pistols, England's Dreaming. We were invited backstage. There's a picture of me with Bowie, and I look really thrilled, actually.
First time meeting him properly?
We were in the same room as him once before, but we didn't meet him. And I said to him, you have this great song on your album called Hello Space Boy. Why don't you, why wasn't it a single? And he turned around to the guy, his PR guy, someone next to him, because he was meeting all these guests, and he said, "See?" And he said, "Well, maybe you guys should remix it for me." And I said, "Yeah, oh, wow, I thought we probably could, yeah." And anyway, I didn't think much more of it, but actually a couple of days later, the phone rang and someone said, "David Bowie's going to call you in 2 minutes." And I said, "Oh, okay, amazing." And anyway, I had some friends over, and I said, "When the phone rings, answer it, because it's going to be David Bowie." And a friend of mine answered the phone and said, "Oh, hi, hello, who can I say speaking?" He goes, "It's David." And anyway, he said, "Will you do this remix?" And so and I found out Chris said, do you want to do this remix, David Bowie? And he said, "Yeah, of course." And we went into a studio in Regent's Park Road in London, and we sort of analysed the track. If you played the album version, our version, that Bowie had this thing nice. He liked doing noise, and he was into.
It's quite industrial, isn't it?
He liked industrial music. He very much liked Nine Inch Nails. He liked things like the Pixies and stuff like that. Stuff which is great, but to be honest, is not really on our radar particularly. And Chris said, "Well, there's only one verse." We come from the Trevor Horn School of Production. It's lazy to repeat the first verse twice, even though I do that. It's a sin. I do the first verse, second verse, and then the first verse is repeated. And even now, I think it's lazy. And he said, "I know what you could do. You could cut up his lyrics," because that's what he does. Because we'd all seen the Alan Yentob documentary. So we decided to do Space Oddity, and we cut up the lyrics. And in doing so, because it's space. And I'd already said to David Bowie backstage at Wembley, it restates your best themes, gender confusion and space. And because it's a great line, do you like boys or girls? It's confusing these days. It's actually almost his most succinct statement on that. And then the phone rang. It was David Bowie. And he said, "Oh, how's it going?" And we said, "Oh, yeah, you didn't have a second verse, so we've cut up the lyrics of Space Oddity to create one." And there was a pause. And I thought, "God." He's annoyed. And he said, "Yeah, sounds like I better come in." And so I went and sang our new verse as a guide vocal for him to sing. Anyway, he came in. It was amazing. He came in, by himself, wearing an overcoat. When he left a scarf. And so we had to send it back to him. And that was amazing. It was from Banana Republic, a very ordinary chain store in America at that time. You expect to be wearing, I don't know, Givenchy or something.
Versace.
And I was just really kept it, actually. So Bowie comes and then he hears the track. We've kind of really pumped it up, made a sort of pop record. We actually borrow another pop song to make the chorus more chorusy. "Hello, space boy, space boy, space boy, space boy, hello." And the reality is we took that from "It's not over, not over, not over, yeah. It's not over, not over, not over, not over, yeah." Grace, a great record. It's a great record. Yeah. So we sort of took that. Anyway, he laughed and said, "Oh, it's fantastic." He said, "But you'll have to sing it." And so it became a duet, which we weren't expecting. And also at the beginning of the record, we sampled something from the start of the Outside album. Has a mysterious atmospheric start, and so we sampled that. And he says this great line, which is by a poet called Brian Geisen: "If I fall, moon dust will cover me." I think that wasn't in the song originally, but it was from another part of the album, and it makes this very beautiful before the drums start pounding in a Pet Shop Boys kind of way. And then I was having this incredible experience that I was sitting, Chris was on the sofa, lying down with his eyes shut, not actually asleep, but looking like he is, which David Bowie, like so many people, was kind of intrigued by the fact Chris appeared to be asleep. And he kept saying, "Chris, what do you think? What do you think?" coming through the microphone. And Chris says, "Oh, what? Why are you asking me?" And he said, "What voice do you want?" This was to do his new vocals. And I said, Cockney, to return to London by Tata. And he went, hello, Spice Boy, you're sleepy now. It was a really fantastic moment, actually.
It's a wonderful record. David Bowie Forever Day. 10 years since Bowie left us. My guest is Neil Tennant. How's the 10 years been for you, Neil? Does it feel bigger than that? Does it feel like Bowie is still here?
It certainly doesn't feel like 10 years ago. I remember, I think we all discovered waking up on that morning on my phone or something. And I remember calling up Chris and talking about it. And we put up a post, because that's what you do. I wrote the post and it said, we are all Bowie's children. By that, I didn't mean we, the whole world, of Bowie's children. I meant our generation of musicians are all, the 80s mob particularly, are genuinely all Bowie's children. It's interesting, right the way through, though, beyond sort of Spandau and Duran and Boy George and to Trent Reznor, maybe Robert Smith of The Cure. Bowie did something. He brought a playing a part thing into pop music that had never been admitted to. It might have existed, Billy Fury wasn't really Billy Fury. He was a bloke, and it was a strain for him, I think, being Billy Fury. The Beatles were essentially a performance of the Beatles. But Bowie really clarified that as a strategy in people's minds. And I think a lot of people took that on board. And in some ways, it's a healthy thing to admit that the person on the stage and in the video and on the record is not really the person in the supermarket queue. It's a projection and a performance. And I think that was Bowie's big contribution that he made with that.
We've just heard two of your other David Bowie choices tonight, Stay and After All, which I believe, Neil, helped tell his importance to LGBTQ plus culture.
After All, you can talk about queer relevance, but what Bowie has is otherness. He's not like other boys, David Bowie. He's got an otherworldly quality. He said he's gay, even though he's married to a woman and got a son. And I didn't know this album at the time, but I remember reading that David Bowie had made a record where he wore a dress on the front cover. And this is the album, The Man Who Sold the World. And it was a statement of fluidity as much as anything else, as much as sexuality. And in After All, I took it at the time to mean it was like guys in some sort of gay bar. But I think it was about his brother in the psychiatric hospital as well. And so it's a fantastic statement of his otherness. We're just taller children, that's all. And I've always thought that the centre of creativity in oneself lies in one's childhood. And the further you get away from your childhood, the further you get away from the core of your creativity. When you've got no embarrassment about playing, because making a record is like playing. Let's just play together. And I know when Chris and I make music, it's sort of like that. It's fun. It's sort of a game as much as anything else. And it's definitely rooted in our childhood. And as Bowie says in this song, we're just taller children, that's all. And I sort of think that's quite an important statement.
When you got to London, Neil, was David thought of and spoken about by the queer community as a torchbearer, as a hero, as an idol?
Remember, queer in those days was an insult. So no one said queer. That's a relatively recent adoption.
Yeah.
You would say gay in those days. I wasn't. I had friends who went to gay clubs, and I occasionally went to them. I didn't consider myself to be gay. I had a girlfriend. But I was sort of curious, I suppose you would say. Yeah, in those days when most of the world was what we would now call homophobic, to go to college, if I turn to the fact that I got my hair cut rather than grown when I went to college, people would have thought that Bowie was a puff, and that if you associated yourself with Bowie, you were a puff as well, because he wore makeup. And this was regarded with suspicion in 1972. In 1973, all has changed, and Bowie, after Jean Genie was a big hit and became mainstream, suddenly lads in Newcastle would be wearing makeup. And it was funny that you had this moment where these very straight lads would be wearing makeup because of Bowie, as he's always known in Newcastle. But so as to the queer community, I wasn't part of a queer community. I had some friends who were sort of gay and other friends who weren't. And what we liked was the otherness. What we didn't want to be like is like everyone else. And in the song Being Boring, one of the friends I shared a flat with died of AIDS, 15 years later, however long that was. And we were never being boring, which, we didn't want to be like other people. And we got that. That was, David Bowie reinforced us in that desire. And also, so did Rock's music, and so did Lou Reed. Of course, Bowie produced the album, Transformer. Lou Reed's big kind of camp song cycle about New York.
Little Joe never once gave it away. Everybody had to pay and pay. A hustle here and a hustle there. New York City is the place where they said, hey babe, take a walk on the wild side.
Where you were in the early 70s, the big films were Clockwork Orange, Cabaret, huge influence in this era. If you look like Susie Sue in the late 70s, she's fundamentally dressed as Sally Bowles, as Liza Minnelli in Cabaret. Everyone wants to be decadent in 1973. The Damned by Visconti. People want to be sort of the glamour of decadence.
In that respect, then, Neil, was Bowie like a friend who'd back you up?
No, he was never going to be a friend because he was otherworldly. He was a sort of god, that you could only aspire to, really. He was more of a religion than anything else. There's always a thing with Bowie that he changes all the time, and he does do that for the first 10 years or something. And, you read in the NME that Bowie, who was touring America with Diamond Dogs, his amazing theatrical statement, which influenced our performance tour many years later, and was now doing soul music. And in fact, there was posters around London for young Americans that said David Bowie's first disco album, because in 1975, disco is a very new thing.
Right.
At this point, I've got a friend at the London College of Fashion, so I hang around with him and people from there, and they all like soul music. They all like Love's Theme by Barry White. They all do The Bump. Then Bowie's making a disco album. So we all get, the day it comes out, we get Young Americans, that beautiful picture on the front cover. And we immediately think, it's not disco. There's one disco track, actually, 1984, towards the end.
They'll split your pretty cranium and fill it full of air and tell you that you're 80, but rather you won't care.
It's sort of soul. But the second track, Win, is, what they used to call blue-eyed soul. It's very, very, very beautiful. And it's the production and the sound and the backing vocals. Remember, you got Luther Vandross singing on this. Ava Cherry, who appears with us on television several years later. And it's sophisticated. And we are all at this point, this is 3 years after Ziggy Stardust, but only 3 years. We are all now trying to be sophisticated, not so much otherworldly as worldly. And we feel this is a very sophisticated album, because it is.
Win by David Bowie, chosen by my very special guest here to close David Bowie Forever Day here on BBC Radio 6 Music, Neil Tennant. Well, you've chosen some beautiful records. I mean, do you still listen to Bowie 10 years after his death, Neil?
Yes, I listen to Bowie quite often.
When would you reach to listen to David?
When I listen to music, I listen to my car driving around Kent, and maybe walking. I do a lot of walking for exercise and enjoyment, but I listen on my AirPods to music. And sometimes I think, oh God, I haven't heard Diamond Dogs for ages. And so I listen to that, for instance. Bowie's last album, Black Star, as it turned out, came out right before he died. It was a bit like Where Are We Now? It came out of nowhere. You'd heard rumours he wasn't very well. And suddenly this album dropped. And what was amazing is that it was really, really good. Bowie always talked about changing, but the reality is he worked with the same band for almost the last 20 years. When we did Hello Space Boy, he phoned me up and he said he wanted us to do Top the Pops with him. But in the course of the conversation, he said, I'm going to make an album, 4 tracks with 3 producers, Moby, Tricky, and Pet Shop Boys. And I said, oh, wow, that would be amazing. Yeah, we'd love to do that. And he said, but I have to have my band. And I said, well, no, we don't work with the band. I said, otherwise there's no point in getting us, because that's not what we are. We don't produce bands. We are, in effect, the band. And that album, of course, never happened, which I think is a shame.
Yeah.
Moby, Tricky, and Pet Shop Boys.
Wow.
4 tracks each.
Wow.
And he stuck with this band for a long time, and I don't think did change his music enough. Then, for some reason, he sees some jazz group in a New York club, because he's living in New York, and for a long time before he dies. And he makes an album with a completely different set of musicians. And it's a great moment, because it doesn't sound like previous recent Bowie. Maybe a bit like Where Are We Now? Which itself doesn't sound the rest of the album it comes from. And he makes this mysterious album that everyone I know plays that whole weekend. And the reason I say that weekend is because I think it's the Monday or the Tuesday we hear he's died. And the album's mysterious, the opening track, Black Star. What on earth is it about, really? And then on side 2, at the end, right at the end of his career, as it turns out, you get 2 of the best records he's ever made. And the last track, I wonder, is he self-consciously, because he obviously knows he's ill, is he self-consciously summing up his life, or his contribution, or what he's tried to do, maybe failed to do? I can't give everything away. But musically, people don't talk so much about David Bowie as a composer. David Bowie always, as all musicians will tell you who are interested in him, has very interesting chord changes. When I was a kid, I had the David Bowie songbook, which came out about 1972 or 3. And I was always struck by what strange chord changes, how he'd suddenly go up a semitone, which you don't normally do. And this last song on his record is a great chord change. And it's a fantastic vocal. And then when you discover a few days later, it's actually the last track on the last album. It's an amazing way of performing right before the curtain falls. It's a really incredible moment. And also David Bowie makes you feel as though it's an instinctive thing, but also clever, that he staged his death in a magnificent way.
Neil Tennant, thank you so much.